then I think we will turn this over to Susie. Would everyone please mute?
Cool. Is there any way I could share my screen? Because then I can talk to pictures, so you don't have to just look at my face the whole time, because that gets a little bit boring.
Susie, everybody's authorized to screen share. You should be able to do that now.
Oh yeah, of course. I totally was. I just didn't. You know, that's me paying mostly attention. I was too intent on listening to everybody introduce themselves. Which I'm really thankful for, and it's wonderful to be here. So you should see this now. So just a little bit more about me. In 1997, I hitchhiked to a place that I had seen on a flyer called Ward Valley. And I actually hitchhiked to Needles, California. I got off of a carrot truck. And the guy who had dropped me off, I was with a friend of mine, the guy who had dropped us off gave me a 10-pound bag of carrots, said, "You're doing the right thing, go get him." I didn't know exactly what I was doing. So I walked into this office in a very hot day in the summer of 97. I think it was the end of June, 1997. And it was the Save Ward Valley office. And I met some folks. I met a kind of red-haired fellow with a big beard by the name of Ginn, who said, "Oh, who are you? What are you doing?" And I was like, "I'm here to help. I got this flyer." And he said, "Okay, well, come on in. What can you do?" I'm like, "Well, I can program. I'm a data programmer. Can I help you with a database or something?" He's like, "Great, sit down, start." And then started, he's like, "Wait, no, we have to go to camp." So we went out to the camp, and that's where I met Sheila. And that kicked off for me this incredible adventure where for the first time in my life, I saw and experienced what the desert was. Because I'm a girl who grew up in New York City, right? For me, you know, there's the trees in Central Park. There was a couple of trees on the street where I grew up, but not a lot. And I didn't know nature. I didn't know anything about this. And I met Sheila. I helped out in the office for a bit. And then through helping out in the office, just a bit, I got introduced to some folks in Las Vegas who were working on issues around Yucca Mountain, around the Nevada nuclear test site, and kind of this broader spectrum of issues. And so I was hooked. I mean, I saw this desert. It was amazing. I met these incredible people who were willing to give up everything, their passion, they put their heart into something they believed in. And I had never really experienced that before. And so in the early part of 98, there was a decision to occupy Ward Valley. And it was actually at that point that I first met Molly. And what Molly taught me, and I just have to share this all with you, because my journey has been very long and varied since then. But I got from Molly this understanding of place and this understanding of how to work really hard in a way that everyone celebrates, and everybody is celebrated for each specific thing that they do. It doesn't matter how big or how small. Every piece matters. Everything. And that's how we get to change, right? And so we won at Ward Valley, which, you know, we won against the mighty giant. As I think about all these, you know, I still think about it. And because we won, because every single piece, no matter how big or how small, every single piece mattered. And because we won, I've had a very overinflated sense of self since that time, and thought, well, you know, I'm going to keep doing stuff that we can win. And anything I put my mind to, we're going to win. So here I am, lo and behold, through a nice journey through WILF, where we did have some nice wins. And now I work with an organization called ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. There's been a few changes, a few stops along the way. I'm in the Netherlands, you know, just far away from Needles, California. But it's an amazing organization, and it's been an amazing path from there to now. And I still truly believe this, and I carry this with me. Every single thing we do to create and affect change matters. And if we do it with integrity and bring everybody in. And so I'm grateful to be here with this group of powerful people today, because you are all also making change that matters and is significant and is protecting the world that I'm living in, and the world that I'm trying to grow my 6-year-old, toothless son in. So I'm going to talk a little bit, that's a little bit more about me. I'm going to talk a little bit, and I won't talk for too long because, we'll get into some conversation. But I want to talk a little bit about nuclear weapons, where they are, what they cost, why they're still around, what they can do, and then what we can do. And so I'm going to go through that, and I'll use the slides. I'll send you the slides after, just in case I talk through them. They have some facts and figures, in case you want them as a reference point. And that's, that's real good. And I said, I'm talking to everybody who's, I think, is pretty much English first language, but I tend to talk really fast. So if I do that, just wave at me and slow me down and say, Susie, chill out. Because I'm 25 years into my journey on this anti-nuclear journey, and I'm still over enthused most of the time, which is great and also kind of tiring. So we'll see where we go. But yeah, so let's get into it. Nuclear weapons. What's happening now? What can we do about it? All right, there we go. So number one, how many are there? This is a question people always ask. There's about a little more than 13,000 of them. This is not as many as there used to be. There used to be over 80,000. And this is amazing. And we would have probably burned up in a horrible fireball of nuclear weapons use if it weren't for the consistent and continued activism of people since the bomb was first invented. So there are about 13,000 of them now. They're in 9 countries. And there are, and most people don't talk about this, there are about another 30, a little more than 30 countries that consider themselves part of kind of a nuclear umbrella. So they have in their national security strategy, the Ministry of Defense plans, whatever, they have the use of nuclear weapons. So it's either countries within NATO and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that say that they will use nuclear weapons, or it's Japan, it's South Korea, it's Australia, and these are countries that also have nuclear weapons in their security strategies. And we like to call them nuclear weapon endorsing states because they support the use of nuclear weapons. And it's important when we talk about them to recognize this is not, it's not just the 9 that are a problem. These are also a problem because they're complicit in the bigger picture. And they have a lovely mouth that says we want nuclear disarmament, but their actions don't prove that. So most of the weapons are still in Russia and the US. They always have been. And it's a huge difference. And I think it's important to recognize this. And this is why we don't see a lot of progress from China or from France or from the UK. They always say, oh no, Russia and the US have to figure out their problem first. They have to fix themselves up first. So Russia has the most weapons. The US is not far behind. And the rest, France, China, the UK, Pakistan, India, Israel, although they won't admit it, and North Korea. And it's important, Iran doesn't have, hi Linda, welcome. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. So, but they're often talked about as one of the bad guys in the nuclear weapon picture. And just to be really, really clear, like when you see it in the newspaper, Iran doesn't have them, okay? They might want to get them, they might not, they can't right now. So they don't have them. And I just want to make sure that that's super clear. It's 9 countries, all of which are led by men, all of which have very small decision-making time between do we launch the missiles and launching the missiles. In the US, the decision-making time is, they say, around 6 to 10 minutes. So how much they spent. Now this, I wanted to throw this in there because I wanted to give some sense of scale and some picture of it. And I talk about money all the time. I talk about numbers all the time, but it's unreal. It's unreal, the numbers. So we did a report last June. I'll do another update this year. And the report is called Complicit, and it's about global nuclear weapons spending. And last year in 2020, so when the pandemic broke, that whole year, the US government spent $70,000 a minute on nuclear weapons. In the UK, they spent $11,000, almost $12,000 a minute. In the UK, they refused to give nurses in the National Health Service a raise. But somehow, they said they couldn't afford a raise for the nurses in the National Health Service. But somehow, they could afford to spend $12,000 a minute on nuclear weapons. And I'm intentionally trying to get you annoyed and a little bit aggravated and a little bit, PO'd, because it's important to take that and focus it. And to think about this and think about all the alternatives, all the other things we could be spending this money on. Like the amount the US spent, this $35 billion, less than that could have ended hunger across the US. Significantly less, like only 2/3 of that could have ended hunger. We think about what would it cost, like there's this whole debate over building back better and how are we gonna pay for build back better? How are we gonna pay for things like forgiving tuition debt or childhood tax credit? Or how are we gonna pay to, I don't know, make sure teachers have a living wage, make sure that kindergarten teachers can have, crayons in the classroom instead of going out of pocket to do that. My sister's a teacher and she goes out of pocket every year for school supplies for her school. But $35 billion in nuclear weapons? Sure, no problem, no problem. That money could have gone to 300,000 beds in intensive care, 35,000 ventilators, 150,000 new nurses, 75,000 doctors. All of this could have been bought with what was spent on nuclear weapons. Now I'm saying this in the baseline assumption that you might think nuclear weapons are a bad idea. And I think nuclear weapons are a bad idea. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why now. So this is a sense of what they cost, where they are, who has them. But let me talk a little bit about why they're still around first. They're not around because they're useful in warfare, right? If they were useful in warfare, they would have been used more times in war. They have been used a lot of times in testing. It's very important to recognize communities across the globe have been devastated by the impact of nuclear weapon testing. They're not in arsenals today because some people truly believe that deterrence that can work, that if you have nuclear weapons, nobody will ever attack you. And I hear this argument a lot. Oh, if the US didn't have nuclear weapons, well, they would have been involved in wars all since nuclear weapons were invented, since they used the nuclear weapons in Japan in 1945. But if you look at history, the US has been involved in wars since nuclear weapons were invented, pretty consistently, pretty much all the time. And they haven't been on the US continent, but there have certainly been problems on the US continent, and there have been attacks on the US continent that were not deterred by nuclear weapons. People live in Europe, so people say, oh, Europe would have been at war, would have been horrible if there weren't nuclear weapons keeping the peace. And they seem to have forgotten that there is a European Union, that there's an economic agreement that covers all of these countries, that there are peace treaties that cover all of this. It's like there's this mindset of it's the weapons or nothing, forgetting the bigger context of history. So why are they still in arsenals? Well, there are companies that build them, and those companies hire lobbyists. In fact, they spent $117 million on lobbyists, just the companies that build them in 2020. And those lobbyists, they go in and they wine and dine congressionals. They make very good friends in the Senate Armed Services Committee. They demand budgets that are exorbitant for defense spending. And they say, you can't live without these weapons. You have to have them. Only the biggest and the toughest have them. And they sell this sense of power. They sell this sense of it's a toxic masculinity times 1,000. They also, these companies that build nuclear weapons, because there are companies involved in the actual building process, they fund think tanks. So supposedly independent think tanks that are supposed to, help provide analysis and research to help congressionals make decisions, they get money from the nuclear weapon industry. And we discovered at least 10 million, or between 5 and 10 million, but that's probably a very low figure. We used very conservative estimates on what think tanks are getting from the nuclear weapon industry. And they publish these reports saying, oh, well, maybe deterrence isn't a bad idea. Maybe we'll keep going with this. Linda, you have a question. Can I? Yes, please.
Yeah, it's 72.6 billion that is allocated by governments. Companies get 27.7. Where's the other 50 billion?
That's a great question. So companies do some of the work, but some of the work is also done. There's U.S. Air Force, right? U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy are all involved in this. So there are bases. There are sailors on submarines right now armed with nuclear weapons, trained to use nuclear weapons. There are planes that are outside of the scope of this figure. We didn't include airplanes like the B-52 Stratofortress, which is designed and can carry nuclear weapons, but can also carry a lot of other things, because it's a big plane. So that's what it is. Yeah.
The Navy and the Army and all the other armed forces, they buy their stuff from corporations too, right?
Yes, they do. But this also covers, it covers personnel costs, it covers facilities costs, and it covers the whole industry behind it, which is not only run by private sector.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, no problem. I'm happy to answer questions. But there's a cycle, and what we're trying to illustrate, and what we tried to do with this report last year, and we're starting to see it take root a little bit, is that when a think tank expert or so-called expert in the nuclear policy field says, oh, but no, you have to have 3 different types of nuclear weapons at least. That's the minimum. We could say, hey, you know what? This guy, his funding comes from Lockheed Martin. And we just start to question it, just the same way that we take lessons, right? So just the same way that when the tobacco industry funded all those scientific studies saying, smoking's not that bad, maybe we should question where the money comes from. It's worth doing. And I've been asked too many times, where does your money come from? But I'm happy to tell people, it comes from a handful of rich people and a couple of foundations. And I'm very grateful to them for doing that. So we really want to talk about and understand this is the reason, this is what keeps them in the arsenals. It's not because they're militarily useful, because they cannot be deployed in war. They can never be used without violating the law of armed conflict, the laws of war. They just can't. And so I want to talk a little bit now about why. And before I get into that, there's one of the things we've noticed, I'm sure you've all been hearing about, I'm concerned with the crisis that's brewing on the Ukrainian border, with the buildup of Russian soldiers on one side of the border. There's on the 27th of February, there's going to be a vote to change the Belarusian constitution, which would allow nuclear weapons to be stationed in Belarus, because there's been some talk about maybe moving nuclear weapons to Belarus. This conflict that's brewing in Ukraine could go nuclear really fast. And this escalation, it's been a long time since we've had a conflict. Like it's not true. There's been a lot of proxy wars between the great powers through the years. whether it be, wars in Latin America, wars in Southeast Asia. But now it's coming a lot closer to individual borders. And we're seeing nuclear weapons being used in the rhetoric in a way that we haven't seen before. So Putin has threatened to deploy nuclear weapons to Belarus if they change their constitution and make it possible. NATO is threatening to move nuclear weapons into Poland, right up on the border. Like this escalation is getting scary, to be honest. And there's an article in Bulletin of Atomic Scientists just last year, which says that a child that's born today, and when I read this, I kind of cried a little, I'm not going to lie about that. A child born today has a 50-50 chance of experiencing nuclear war. And there's a couple of reasons. The likelihood of use is increasing. They're applying artificial intelligence to reduce decision-making time around when you decide to launch the bombs and to automate certain parts of the cycle, right? So now you have human beings checking radar to see if it's what's coming in. What are potentially things that might be coming in? Is it a missile? Is it a weather balloon? What is this? And then they have to make a decision. Do I send this up the line and escalate? Do we send a response or not? And they're talking about automating that. And they're also talking, and so to make that decision time quicker. And I started off with the decision time is around 6 minutes, 6 to 10 minutes now. If that's quicker, that's not good for anybody. If it's because once you fire a missile, it lands where it's going to land. Like these intercontinental ballistic missiles, they leave Nebraska, it's Wyoming and South Dakota. They leave, and in 30 minutes, they hit their target on the other side of the world. You can't call them back. You can't shoot them down. So if you make that decision in 6 minutes, that's crazy. And they're trying to reduce that decision-making time. And those who have gone up the ranks inside of militaries now don't have any kind of experience of the tragic horror of what a nuclear weapon does. And that is also a worrying thing. So that's what Martin Hellman was talking about in this article in the bulletin, that because of all of these factors, the risk is getting greater than it's ever been. And it's quite worrying. So let me talk about what they can do. You'll see this moving. If some climate scientists, including at the University of Colorado at Boulder and at Rutgers University in New Jersey, did some modeling. They looked at, what would happen if about 100 weapons were used in a conflict between India and Pakistan, because that's another hot spot. They're both armed with nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapons hasn't kept them from fighting each other. So what would happen? And they found that it would kick up so much dust and soot into the atmosphere that would cause a planetary cooling of a few degrees. And while that might not sound terrible, considering we're all, quite concerned about a planetary temperature raise of a few degrees, the light blockage of the dust and soot that would sit in the troposphere would actually mean that crops wouldn't be able to grow. It would be dark. There would be summers of darkness. And they base this modeling on what happened with major volcanic eruptions. So there'd be at least one and maybe 2 summers of darkness, which would cause massive crop failures around the planet, and about 2 billion people would be at risk of famine. And that's for 100 weapons. So the risk is going up, and the climate consequences are mind-boggling. And the thing is, if the consequences of the use of a nuclear weapon don't stop at the border, they don't stop in the city, they don't stop in the target area, they don't stop at ground zero. It's a global risk, even if the use is on the other side of the globe. It would still affect us. And living in California, you know what smoke does. You know what happens when the light isn't coming through clearly, right? This is a worrying thing. And their modeling has been really helpful in changing the discussion around this. And if a weapon does get used, like it's a weapon, it's a bomb, right? And bombs do things. Bombs, I mean, they burn stuff up. It's a huge heat impact. There is an electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear weapon that would fry every cell phone tower, every cell phone for a 100-mile radius, right? And this is just one weapon, a small weapon. There's the blast wave, the actual physical shock wave, which could lift and fling cars like they're nothing. I think about the Marvel, I'm a big fan of Marvel movies, right? So think about the way the Hulk flings cars around with no problem. And a nuclear weapon is like a billion times the Hulk. And there's the ionizing radiation. And, you know, with Mothers of Peace, you all have worked so hard on dealing with this persistent ionizing radiation within your communities, released by Diablo Canyon, released by San Onofre, released by the reactors in your communities. You know about the harm that this causes. You know that already what this can do, and especially what it does to women's bodies, because it is different than what it does to men's bodies, because we are physiologically different. And it does have a long-term and persistent effect. And that long-term exposure, even at very low levels, can be very, very bad. And then of course there's fallout. And the fallout is that the kick up, the dust of that ion, that's irradiated dust that then goes and hits the wind stream and blows where it blows. And we've been able to model what happens with fallout because of other terrible instances, because of 3 Mile Island, because of nuclear testing, because of Chernobyl. We know it doesn't stay where it's supposed to. It moves all over. Because of what happened in Fukushima, we know how bad this can be. So all of these things, though, were never getting talked about at the international level, right? They were just talking about, oh, security policy. Oh, sorry, I put on my grumpy dude voice when I talk about this. Forgive me. It's too many UN meetings. Like, they all sound like grumpy dudes, mostly because a lot of them are. But they weren't talking about this until 2013. And in 2013, they started a series of conferences. First one was in Norway, on what are the humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. And at that conference in Oslo, I was in the washroom, as you know, a human being is. I heard somebody crying, and because of being who I am, I was like, "Hey, what's the matter? Are you okay?" And it was a diplomat from an Eastern European country who said, "I didn't know that's what they did. Nobody ever talked about this before. I didn't know." And she wasn't the only one. She was the only one I saw crying, but she wasn't the only one who had that experience, this revelation. This is what nuclear weapons do. And because of these catastrophic consequences, we made them illegal. And it's 4 years from that first conference in 2013 until negotiations started in the UN in 2017. The treaty was adopted in 2017 and it entered into force. So it got the 50 signatures and ratifications it needed to become binding international law last January 2021. This is a group of women in Tucson, Arizona, who are consistent, persistent resistors to the Raytheon plant that's in Tucson, because Raytheon makes missiles for nuclear weapons. So now I'm going to talk, oh gosh, I keep talking. I'm going to go a little bit and just try to go a little quickly on some of the tools that we put together for things people can do. And so first thing is, we've gotten city council resolutions, about 500 or more. I actually lost track. City council resolutions around the world calling on cities to support the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, calling on the federal government to join the treaty, looking at local measures that they can do. And I know in California, I know Santa Barbara has one. I'm pretty sure that LA has one. San Francisco has a long time nuclear weapon free zone ordinance, which was a model for others. And this is a way to kind of come back to these cities that many people went to during the sane freeze movement and say, hey, here's something else. New York City just passed legislation to update its nuclear weapon free zone status. And New York City is also requiring its city pension funds to divest from the companies that are involved in nuclear weapon production. So it's a way to kind of keep talking to the city, keep connected to the city. And we've got model resolutions on the website. There's parliamentarians, so Congress people, and we encourage Congress people everywhere to sign a pledge that they will support the treaty and actively work for their governments to support the treaty. Eleanor Holmes Norton, it was the first U.S. one to sign. Rashida Tlaib, there have been a couple of others in the U.S. that have signed. I think about 4 within the U.S. that have signed now. And it's good. And I think Ted Lieu is a senator from California, if I remember correctly. Ted Lieu has been great in sponsoring legislation to reduce the risks around nuclear weapons. And so, I mean, no politician is perfect. And I'm sure we all have issues with every one of them. I know I always do. But that's been a positive thing. And he could go further. And so we can encourage him to do that. And then the project that I work on most fiercely and most passionately is this project around the investment. So I look at the companies that are behind nuclear weapons. I look at what banks are financing them. Like, I'm sure some folks might be connected to Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo does not have a very good history when it comes to financing really nefarious industries. Wells Fargo has a human rights record that is atrocious, whether it be around financing weapons, the weapons complex, or financing Dakota Access Pipeline. Wells Fargo needs to get its Human Rights Act together. And it's been challenged by a lot of people, including its own shareholders, to do so. So I work on this question of investment, and what banks, what pension funds, what mutual funds, are connected to this, and to get people to, take their money out. If we cut off the flow of money, we can change things. We've gotten 2 companies that were involved in the nuclear weapon industry to get out of the industry so far, and I think we can keep doing that. Like I said at the beginning, we won at Ward Valley, so I'm dedicated to finding ways to keep winning. And we're winning on the company question right now, at least for the time being. Excited about that. And then there's, of course, actions. People are doing actions all over. This is an action we did to celebrate at the base. The US keeps 20 nuclear weapons in the Netherlands, about an hour from my house. So when the ban treaty went into effect last year, we did an action at the base. Just gathered, and that's the airstrip on the base, which is why that's my son with his has his ear protectors, because they were flying fighter jets for a while, and they're really loud. And yeah, so we just went to say, hey, these weapons are illegal, and we put up signs around the base saying these weapons are illegal. You need to be within law now. And I was thinking tomorrow is the anniversary of the biggest anti-war demonstration that I've ever participated in, and it was the anti-war in Iraq demonstration in 2003. And it's been 19 years since that was a game-changing day for me in terms of what people can do and where the limits of what people can do. And I was thinking about that and thinking about, there's a lot of actions on the nuclear weapons front coming as well. The Code Pink, Vets for Peace, and others have called for a week of action at the companies involved in the production of weapons, the war industry as a whole, right on Easter. So it's April 17th to the 22nd. And there's going to be a week of action for nonviolence in September, the week of September 21st, with the 26th focused on nuclear weapons. And there's always something, right? There's always something people can do. And I truly believe that. And I want to end just with a thought somebody said to me recently that's been really stuck in my mind. And it's this idea, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. And when it comes to nuclear weapons, I think we can get rid of them. I think we can see an end to the nuclear era as a whole. So I hope I'm right. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Susie. And I hope you're right too. Very good. So questions. One thing I wanted to say real quick is, One of my favorite memories of Susie was sitting in my tent at Ward Valley, making tobacco ties for Rick's and my wedding that night. That was a great day. Yeah, so any questions? Just Sherry and then Marty.
Okay, the dogs may bark in the background, but okay. My question is, could you segue somewhat toward nuclear power and show the relationship between the weapons and the power?
Marty, can you ask me your question too, so that I can maybe do both of them at the same time? If you would,
Oh,
please.
sure. Years ago, there used to be, I think it was from Hiroshima, the mayor's march to abolish nuclear weapons. Whatever happened, and people would go to their city councils and ask them to sign a resolution about that. Do you know what happened to the mayor's agreement?
Cool. Two great questions. Thank you very much. So Sherry, I'll start there. When the U.S. nuclear power industry came in, I think you probably all know this. You probably have to tell the story way better than I can. But it came in as a backdoor to make sure that the capacity to build nuclear weapons couldn't be eliminated. This is the idea behind the whole Atoms for Peace, right? It was, let's make sure that the technology's out there. So if we need to find a way to create highly enriched uranium or plutonium, which are the key components with, the key nuclear components within nuclear weapons, that we can do that. The issue of nuclear power is getting a lot more, it's waxing and waning, right? So within the EU, there's a huge fight going now in the financial sector, because the EU just said, oh, maybe nuclear power is not the worst thing. Maybe we can count it as a green technology. And like all the sustainable investors, they were just like, no, no, put their foot down. They issued all these letters. They're like, no, we can't do that. And they represent trillions of assets under management. Like they're not a little force in this discussion. They're still fighting about it. We'll see what happens. The thing is, there's a couple of things. So when a country starts developing nuclear energy, it is required to disclose all of its capabilities to the International Atomic Energy Agency. And if it doesn't do that, then it's not allowed to get not supposed to get the technology. And that's the way to prevent it from being used for weapons in the future. That doesn't apply to the countries that have nuclear weapons, because they were just like, no. And the five first ones that had nuclear weapons just said, no, we have other types of agreements. North Korea pulled out of its agreements around this, but they actually got their tech from Pakistan. We've never seen an instance of a clear line between a nuclear power plant and a nuclear weapon, but the impacts on communities is very similar, right? So you have that persistent ionizing radiation, which comes from nuclear power plants regardless, as opposed to nuclear weapons, which is only if they're used. And then you have up the supply chain. And so you have this mining of uranium that's needed for both weapons and power, and that has devastated communities. And it's always politically disenfranchised, marginalized communities, predominantly indigenous communities and communities of color, right? And whether it's the mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, whether it's the mines in Australia, whether it's the mines in New Mexico, whether it's the mines in Canada, all of these, they never mine for this stuff in a place, that has political power. So there's a lot of ties there, and it's a huge social justice issue. And I think there's a lot of connection in that. And when it comes to the end of it, right? When it comes to, we have no place to put waste. Still, we have no place to put waste. whether the waste comes out of decommissioning and dismantling nuclear weapons, because there's going to be waste from that, or whether it comes from the reactors, because there's way more waste from that. Like, there's no place to put it, and there's no way to ever make it safe, ever. And so there is a, there's a connection there as well, and looking out for what comes ahead, what comes down the line for future generations. In both of these instances, we have to keep our minds on that. Marty, you're talking about the mayors. There's an organization. It was founded by the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's called Mayors for Peace. It brags now something like 5,000 members around the world, maybe even 6,000. It's huge. And mayors are encouraged to sign up. And there's within California, the Western States Legal Foundation, Jackie Cabasso. I don't know, some of you may know her, some of you may not. She is the North American coordinator for Mayors for Peace. She's absolutely brilliant. And she has gotten the US Conference on Mayors to call for reductions around nuclear weapons spending, to call for protecting communities, to call, to do anything to reduce the risk around nuclear weapons, as well as really thinking about this linkage between what do we mean by sustainability. And considering cities now are looking to pick up their sustainability commitments, there's opportunity there to reinforce that sustainable is not nuclear, never has been. And that what we actually need to do is look for decentralized, greener alternatives. So that's where that's at. I'll be happy to, if you don't know Jackie and you want to connect, I'm happy to put you in touch. She's awesome. She's just, she's amazing.
Yeah, I know Jackie and I have her contact info, so maybe we all can talk about this. That would be great.
Yeah,
Sheila, you have a question? Unmute yourself.
Yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to mention with Raytheon and the connection to Cal Poly, that Bill Swanson, retired CEO and executive director of Raytheon, really did. He got his training at Cal Poly as an engineer, and he poured in a lot of money to the College of Engineering at Cal Poly. College of Engineering used to have in February a career day that was heavily heavily protested by Progressive Student Alliance and some others for its Raytheon presence. And I wondered if, let's see, how is this? So Trump comes along with a Space Force. He establishes this Space Force. And I'm wondering where that's going. Certainly that's going to be nuclear weapons in space. And my question is, how is it? The aerospace industry must be just delighted that there's a Space Force. And how is that going? And where is it going, I guess? Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Sheila. I think there's two things I want to pick up on there. One is about the UC system. Like you remind me, it's not Cal Poly per se, but the University of California system and the UC regents are part of private sector consortia that run the nuclear weapon laboratories in the US. So Lawrence Livermore Laboratory up there in Livermore, CA, and then the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Like the UC, University of California regents are in the joint ventures that run those facilities. There is a direct connection between this. There's also, we've got a lot of research on the universities that are involved in the nuclear weapon complex. And when you look across the US, it's like 50 universities that are very heavily involved. And they get funding to do so. And it's a bummer for applied physics students who want to go in and do something super cool, like, figure out how to make planes fly with no carbon footprint. Like, that's a cool challenge for a physicist, right? But instead they wind up working on weapons and often don't have a choice because there's so few other options. Yeah, Vandenberg Air Force Base is another great one. Let me come to Space Force, and then we'll I'll touch on Vandenberg really quick. With the Space Force, there is an existing agreement since 1963 or so. Yeah, I think it's 63 or 68, 63. It's the Outer Space Treaty that prohibits the deployment of nuclear weapons to outer space. So that's great. That's great, you know, and a treaty is as good as it is as people's integrity to uphold that treaty. So far, there is no plan to deploy nuclear weapons into space. There is a lot of cash flying into the same companies that make missiles to be armed with nuclear weapons as to make the components for Space Force. Defense News just had a very lengty article about the uniforms that are being decided on for Space Force, which I thought was rather weird. But that is also a piece of this bigger picture. But right now, when it comes to nuclear weapons being deployed into space, there is an existing agreement that will not happen. That said, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the whole thing is that they go into space and then come back out before they detonate, right? And so there is constantly a risk to space. There are a lot of risks to space, and it's, you know, there are also a lot of efforts to get space to be seen as a global commons, and I think that's a good way. The way that we've kind of are meant to look at Antarctica as a global commons. It's not for any one or another, but it's for the collective benefit of all. We'll see where that goes. It's very tricky because space is getting super crowded and there's a lot of satellites out there. Vandenberg, I'm so glad you brought up, Marty, I'm so glad you brought up Vandenberg. Vandenberg is where the missiles are tested, the intercontinental ballistic missiles are tested. And they're sent, and this still gets my goat, like they're launched from Vandenberg, which leaves a terrible, like when you launch a missile, you dump so much fuel into the air and into the sea, it's gross. That's it. They launch them and then they launch them to the Marshall Islands, where the US did nuclear weapon testing as well, about 67 tests. And the 1st of March is an anniversary of one of those big tests, the Castle Bravo test, which was horrible and has made some of those islands, like, you know, Keeney Island, uninhabitable. People can't go home. And to be forever displaced because a country on the other side of the planet decided it wanted to show that it was a big guy. It sucks. So that happens at Vandenberg, and usually there's some notice in advance, but it's only like maybe 24 hours, and it's very difficult to know when they're coming, because they don't want to announce it too early. There've also been a bunch of like misfires that land in the Pacific. Luckily, they haven't hit anybody or any ships or container ships that we know of. But you know, we want to talk about supply chain disruption. So, you know, sending missiles into the ocean, that doesn't help. Sorry, I have a bonkers sense of humor. I see Jane. Yes, Jane. I see that the San Luis Obispo voted to divest from the war machine. Yeah, Mayor's Peace and Code Pink. Code Pink's amazing. Code Pink does awesome stuff. Code Pink is a great organizing force across the US. I'm so glad that we get to work with them on a bunch of things, and they're great. Yeah. Let's see, Linda. Hey, Linda.
Another question. You said that since 1963, the Outer Space Treaty prohibits weapons in outer space. But then you said ICBMs go through outer space. So has anybody sued countries that have ICBMs for potentially using outer space and violating the treaty that prohibits the use of space?
Well, no, not that I know of, but it's the deployment of weapons to be stationed in space that is prohibited.
Oh,
So they can't be, yeah. So it's but I love your thinking. I really like that, and I wonder. I think that's worth bringing up. I'll flag it to some folks and say, hey, can we talk about this? You know,
it's a UN treaty, or
Yeah.
what kind of a treaty? Yeah,
it's a UN treaty, and
Okay.
so it's been ratified by all of the Like it's been ratified by all the countries with nuclear weapon capacity.
Okay.
So yeah, so it's quite a good, I mean, it's a good treaty. Like there's some good treaties out there.
We
Yeah.
actually did it?
Yeah.
We signed it?
Back in
Oh,
the 60s, the US was amazing at ratifying treaties, and in the 70s and in some of the 80s, but
uh-huh.
the US isn't so great at ratifying treaties anymore.
Mhm.
And that's why we have to look for, it's like US Congress seems to get blocked on stuff. So we have to look for other creative ways to change the world, right?
Yeah,
Congress won't do it. If the government won't do it, the Congress won't do it. Well, let's make other people do it, or encourage other people to be enthusiastic about seeing how much they want to do it already.
right.
Any
What,
further questions? Oh, Eric, go ahead.
thank you. I don't have a visible hand, but
I
thank
know.
you. But amazing presentation. And I guess we know now that the UC Regent meetings, like so many, are virtual, so they are not a place to physically assemble. What would you consider the key places in California, either institutional or corporate, to physically assemble and be present in protest? And are there any groups organizing such protests around those places at present? And obviously, when the regents go back to meeting in person, their meeting place will be such a place.
Eric, it's a great question. And I know for sure that there's always activities that take place at Livermore, at the entrance to Livermore. And I know Tri-Valley Cares organizes a lot of those. So I know that happens. And I'm honestly not sure. Like, that's the thing. I mean, it is a tricky time to look at things. And I don't actively know. But maybe somebody else on this call does. Marty, do you know?
I know that, in fact, I participated in one at Vandenberg a few years ago. There was, in the past, there was like a Catholic workers that were there, and a few other organizations, but mostly there were just people that, some were bussed in, but I just drove over because I heard about it. And there was only one woman that was arrested that day. It was very interesting because we were all there, and there was only one woman, and she was on a walker, and she was wearing a bright red suit and with her white hair, and she went right down there in front of this squadron of soldiers, big soldiers, and she was arrested. And it just, it was very, very touching indeed.
Yes, and Marty and I also went to Lawrence Livermore, 3 years ago for the August. And actually what I'll do, I'll get a hold of Mara Leah. She might have an idea to help us with Eric's question.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Cool.
Any further questions?
I'm gonna drop my email in the chat. Oh, Carol, please.
Carol.
Yes, it's just a small question, but I had assumed that there would be nuclear weapons all around the former Soviet Republic. So, not just in Russia proper, but in the Ukraine and Belarus and all these other places. Is that not the case?
No. So that's the thing. They, when the Soviet Union broke up in 91, there was a deal that all the weapons go back to Russia, and there were individual deals made with other places they had been deployed. So Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, they were all centralized back into Russia. The capacity to host them in those countries was dismantled, right? It was taken apart. It was 91 in 91. Then the senior President Bush and Gorbachev did this deal, where they didn't make a treaty because they didn't think they'd get it through. But they made a deal where they each decided to get rid of a ton of weapons, just on their own, but together. And so they dropped the number of nuclear weapons from, I think it was about, let's say it was about 75,000. They dropped them by about 20,000, 25,000. And that was one of the great things about the like there's one of the things, like the tension was off, and that led to a bunch of negotiations, official negotiations and treaties between the two to legally be able to enforce and verify that the weapons had been dismantled and destroyed. There was a big project to bring dismantled Russian weapons. People were worried that because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were going to get stolen, or the materials would get stolen. So there was a big project by Senators Nunn and Lugar to bring them to the US, where they were converted into power in Tennessee, and that powered the Southeast for about 15 years. It was good to get the weapons out. It was bad because, it brought up like at Watts Bar, and there's other reactors that kind of puts more emphasis there. But it did make it so those weapons could never be turned into, that material could never be turned into weapons again. So that was handy. With the conflict in Ukraine, we've seen a lot of right-wing journalists, at least in Europe, say, if Ukraine hadn't have given back those weapons to the Russians, they would never have been invaded, which is actually quite BS. Because number one, Russia would never have let them keep them in 91, like that wouldn't have been possible. And number two, the US would never have let them keep them in 91, and neither would France or the UK. Like, they were all locked up. They're like, no, you don't have a government, you don't even have the start of a government, you can't have nuclear weapons. We're going to do everything we can to stop that. So that's a story that is being told now to say nuclear weapons are good for you, when in fact we see that that's actually just a mess. Yes.
Just a clarifying
Eric,
question.
please.
International situation. At the beginning, you gave us the number of 32 nations that quote unquote endorse the use of nuclear weapons, 9 that own, make them, etc. That the 9 nations to which they belong. Are those 32 then nations within which they can be deployed, or is that a separate category? And
No.
if allowed, it changed its constitution, would that make 33?
Yes. So if Belarus does change its constitution, and this is a whole big thing, like Lushenko, who's in control of Belarus right now, he like the democratically elected leader of Belarus is now, like, her family's in hiding and she's in exile in Lithuania. All right, Lushenko, who's a massive human rights abuser, keeps throwing journalists in jail, and is controlling Belarus, and is a good old buddy of Putin. He is trying to do this in Belarus. If they do change their constitution on the 27th of February, then they could be deployed there. The US deploys weapons outside of its territory. It's the only country that does. And they're in the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, Turkey, although they might not be in Turkey anymore, and Italy, because they were in Turkey at this base that's not super stable, and there's issues with Turkey too. So that's a lot of it's a lot of stuff, but I hope that answers your question. And I think Linda had one, and I see there's the chats, there's a lot of stuff in the chat too.
Related to what Eric just said. So if Belarus votes to allow nuclear weapons, they will be nuclear weapons that are in support of Russia then, right?
So Russia would own them and operate them, but they'd just be sitting in Belarus. But the thing is, Belarus doesn't have the infrastructure to host them right now. So they'd have to build a bunch of stuff. It's not like they could sit on a plane on a runway. But that's number one, not very safe. Everybody knows it's pretty dumb. They're not going to do that, right? It's just, even like it's there are protocols and the certification around where you can put nuclear weapons is pretty strict, which is good.
So will
Yeah.
it be a fair election?
I don't know, and I would not put money on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, and then Ace put into the chat that he has a video. It's 55 seconds long. And his comment was the U.S. has exploded 1,151 nuclear weapons. It's usually described as 1,054 quote unquote tests and 2 uses, but one test sometimes included multiple blasts. He completed an animation showing each one. Are people interested in seeing that? Taking a minute out to see that? Yes, okay. Ace, I know that you're pretty tech proficient, so you can share that, right?
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, and I'll start it. Did it start? Yes.
There it goes.
Okay, and it can be stopped and played at slow speed too once I release it. Right now, it's just a video of it.
Is
And
that the Nevada test site in the lower left corner?
yeah, it's Nevada in the lower left and the 2 islands, the Marshall Islands on the right. And my count was 66, not 67. And I think one of the ones that's in the Johnson Island area is normally included. And that's why there's a slightly different count. But anyway, this actually does show all of the bombs. It's got all of the totals. You can stop it at any time and look at it, the individual data. It's all, of course, taken from the Department of Energy.
Right, and realize that every single one of those, except for the ones, of course, on the Marshall Islands outlined, but if they're at the Nevada test site, that makes the Western Shoshone Nation the most nuclear bombed nation on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Ace. So, any further questions? Thank you, Susie. That was great.
It was.
It was
Thank you, Susie.
fantastic.
One
Yay.
final
Thank you all.
One final question. In the practical world of crazy, twisted diplomacy of 2022, who could effectively enforce blatant violations of treaties and how? And is there any way citizens of a violating country can help that happen?
Great question. So like the whole thing, so there's different ways to, if the treaty is violated, there's different things that people can do. Governments will come together, they'll sanction. That's usually the first tool. They'll cut off diplomatic relations. We can do trade embargoes. Citizens within a country that are violating a treaty can take nonviolent direct action. There's treaty enforcement squads that go around in different parts of the world that are going into different bases or at the companies involved in illicit activities that are citizen actions. There's raising concerns at like being a persistent objector to whether it be through local press. And I'll tell you something, please, when you write to, like, it doesn't matter if it's the Penny Saver and it has a letter to the editor in the Penny Saver, like, or whatever is, you know, the local free press, whatever it is, if you name a company or a politician, it gets on their desk. And it doesn't matter if the circulation is 2,000 or 200,000 or 2 million. Getting something, saying people's name, being bold like that, it makes a difference. So I want to encourage people, you know, do that. And there's ways to kind of push that way. The governments that are part of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons will be getting together in a first meeting of states parties in the next few months, at which time they will come up with a plan for how to get other countries on board, to set up things like a science and technical advisory board, to think about what they're going to do to also address the harm caused by nuclear weapons. Because this nuclear weapon ban treaty is the first time that the impact of nuclear weapons is addressed. It has language in the preamble specifically recognizing the disproportionate impact on indigenous nations, which you know, we're really grateful for the countries that put that in, Mexico, Costa Rica, to get that language in there. And so they will also look at how they're going to use their diplomatic relations to put pressure on the countries with nuclear weapons or that endorse nuclear weapons to come into the treaty or to to take steps towards coming to the treaty. Sorry, that was a lot. That was very
Alrighty, thank you.
long-winded.
Oh,
Sorry.
Sherry, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I have a quick question. When you said if you write like a letter to the editor and you mention a corporation or something, it sits on the desk, do you mean of the newspaper? And so it doesn't get printed? Or do you mean it's on the desk of the company you've labeled?
Oh yeah, if you name a company, their communication staff has to deal with it. And if it comes up a couple of times for the same kind of general thing, it does, they will start they'll put press releases on their website, they'll start deploying their own communications folks. You'll see things on their Twitter, like addressing these concerns. We got sent 200 emails, which is not like a lot, like you can get a robot to do this. But we had 200 emails go to a bank to say, change your policy. And the bank said, they took the language from the emails because it was a template, and they turned it around and used what the UK government would say in response, which is awful, to be honest. But they also said, oh, because we see this as such an urgent concern by so many people, instead of reviewing the policy every 3 years, we will now review it every year. It's amazing what a few people can do. It's like Margaret Mead wasn't wrong. You know, and when I came onto the call today and I heard what happened in Atascadero, you know, when I hear what's going on, like you are folks who know how to get stuff done. And so I'm, you know, whatever you decide to do, if I can be of any help, please let me know. And as you continue to work on these really pressing issues that you're already doing so much on, please have my thanks and sincere appreciation, because you're amazing. So I'm really grateful. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is
Alrighty.
there anything you need help with in the Netherlands?
Yeah. Yeah, stopping that bridge from getting torn down. There you go.
Right? The
Right.
Bezos, we're just going to rename it the Bezos Bridge. It's ridiculous. I think I'm gonna step off because I know you have a business meeting from here. I'm gonna step off and just say thanks. My email is in the chat, and Molly, I'll send you the PowerPoint so you can share. Okay.
Sounds like a plan.
Seriously, thank you all so much. It was lovely to see some of you again and to meet some of you for the first time. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And eventually get a good night's sleep.
Right. And Susie, next February is going to be the 25th anniversary of the occupation. I will keep you informed. It would be so wonderful if you could work it out and to come. We'll get you comped. We'll get you comped at the IV.
Are you talking about the Ward Valley occupation?
The occupation of Ward Valley, yeah. All right,
Thanks,
thanks,
everybody.
Sus.
Bye.